Hi, and welcome to the Open Source Exchange. Glad you've joined us. My name is Kendra Morton. I'm a Principal Product Marketing Manager at Revenera, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. We're thrilled to have you for what's bound to be a great panel today. So before we get our experts introduced, I'd like to go through a few quick notes to make your experience on this platform a little bit better. So if you would like to submit a question, over on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a Q&A tab. Please type in your question there. And you can do that anytime throughout the event. You don't have to wait until the end. We'll take questions throughout. And then we'll also pause at the end one more time once we've gotten through all of our topics to give you another shot at asking a question of our panelists before we close things out. And please note that questions are only seen by the panelists and myself. Okay, so hopefully it's not the case, but as we know, things do happen. If you're having any technical difficulties at all, head on over to the chat and you can message my friend and colleague, Jacob Ward. He's our wonderful producer and mastermind behind the scenes, and he'll get it all sorted out for you. And then finally, we have some resources under the handouts tab, that are relevant to the topics we'll go over today. So be sure to head over there before signing out and have your pick of material to broaden today's discussion. So, like I said, we're very excited once again to bring you another Open Source Exchange event. We've got some great topics lined up for discussion with a very talented and experienced panel. So what are we going to talk about? So I recently saw an article on Forbes.com back in August of this year that said software supply chain security is everyone's business. Supply chain threats differ from and have the potential to be more damaging than classic attacks because a single breach can impact hundreds or even thousands of different targets. And it can be difficult to detect issues downstream. Because software is essential to executing, daily business operations, supply chain security is a crucial responsibility of every organization, and it really stretches beyond just security teams. We saw a lot of news circulating this past year about the supply chain, cybersecurity executive order, security breaches, and some high-profile vulnerabilities, such as the more recent OpenSSL issue. Net, there's a lot to talk about and explore, especially if we want to go into the new year better prepared to tackle or embrace new trends and issues each of us will probably most likely face. So our panel today is going to address three main themes. So the first theme, trends in open source and third-party software management. Theme 2, the evolving role of the software bill of materials. And theme 3, real-world open source governance with OpenChain best practices. And with that, let's introduce our panel. And speakers, if you could, when I call your name, tell our audience a little bit about yourselves. And Shane Coughlin, would you mind getting us started?
All right. Hi, I'm Shane Coughlin. I'm the general manager of the OpenChain project at the Linux Foundation. So my focus is on how we build a trusted supply chain with the optic of open source and types of compliance, most particularly license compliance, but we also address things like security. So my focus here today is the high-level management of dealing with things like license compliance and the processes behind them.
Okay, very good. Russ?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Russ Ealing. I am the founder of OSS Consultants. We're a business dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes manage their use of open source software. So we help companies with everything from scanning an audit of your software to building an entire open source program. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. I had responsibility for designing and implementing a successful open source governance program at GM, which was among the first of its kind in 2013. As the compliance officer at GM, I built the OSPO responsible for reviewing software in every part used in every GM vehicle across the globe. And then today, myself and the rest of the team offer our recognized industry-leading expertise to help companies of all sizes scan, audit, and report on their software, as well as helping them to create some of the most efficient, comprehensive, and robust open source program offices on the planet.
Great job. Thank you, Russ. Stephen Gillespie.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good to be here. I'm Stephen Gillespie. I'm a partner in the intellectual property group at Fenwick & West, LLP. Over the past 2 decades, we've managed about 2,500 technology M&A deals with a combined value over $7.5 billion. We currently average about 150 to 200 technology M&A deals each year, and on both the buy side and the sell side. And one of my roles in our tech M&A practice is helping our clients implement best practices for open source diligence and risk mitigation. And so, we have done that across deals for serial acquirers like Cisco and Amazon and Symantec, and across a lot of sell-side deals as well, just helping our sell-side clients, respond to diligence and prepare for diligence, and including both on sales of the companies and on IPOs.
Very good. Thank you, Stephen. Marcus.
Hi, my name is Marcus Lucero. I'm with Revenera. I'm a senior analyst here in our services department, helping companies, manage and audit their code bases, discover open source software, and find security risks within their code bases. I also am the lead in our training program for our product Code Insight, and work directly in customer success as well.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. And Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Meeker. I'm an attorney and venture capitalist specializing in open source software licensing. As an attorney, I've worked in Silicon Valley for nearly 30 years with an increasing focus on open source software. Today, that's just about all I do in my legal practice. I'm also a general partner at OSS Capital, which is a early stage venture fund that invests only in commercial open source development. I've been on the drafting team for a few open source licenses and a few adjacent source available license like Elastic, Consulent, Redis, and so forth. And I have a book called Open Source for Business, which you can get for free if you go to my website.
Very good. Thank you, Heather. And last but certainly not least, Alex.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Alex Ryback. I head up our products team at Revenera, focused on software composition analysis solutions. I also head up our open source program office and part of our cybersecurity team internally. So I've kind of got my hands in lots of different pots from both security, license compliance. We're also kind of an interesting spot because we're a software supplier, but we also offer SEA solutions. So we've got a bit of a higher standard of care on our product. So make sure that we're following all the rules, complying with all license obligations, and making sure that everybody on the engineering side is trained and accountable and understands why we need to do all these things. So happy to be part of this panel, and thanks for everybody for joining.
Yeah, thank you. So like I said, a great and very talented and experienced panel we have today. And with that, let's launch into our first theme and our first set of questions. We're going to cover off on trends in open source and third-party software management. So my first question to the panel, I'm going to come just right out of the gate with: what major trends do you see coming in 2023 around open source and third-party software management? Who would like to kick us off with that?
I could.
Yep, there we go.
All right. So I think SBOMs, which we're going to talk about separately today, but still definitely a trend that will continue. On the tooling front, I've seen increased requests this year for guidance towards a single SCA solution that can support all or multiple build environments and languages. So the tea leaves are suggesting there may be less of an appetite for a multi-tool approach for these organizations that might have multiple build environments and a wide array of languages to support. Also on the tooling front, detection of snippets or partial use of open source seem to have a renewed interest across organizations, and maybe somewhat surprisingly by tooling vendors that didn't previously support that functionality. So, and actually the SCA tooling space itself went through some changes this year with not just functionality and capability, but also new entries and re-entries into this space.
Yeah, Russ, we're seeing that a lot in our services team as well. Like, we get a lot more requests. Before, we saw a lot of what we consider kind of standard audits. And now we're looking at this much more forensic level auditing, where we're looking at code snippets. We're looking at a much more deep dive of not only dependency packages, but transitive dependencies. And so we're seeing people trying to look at their whole ecosystem and not just these minor ecosystems, let's say Jenkins, but we're looking at languages like Rust and cargo packages that are kind of taking over kind of the C development world, and some of the frameworks are starting to uptick, and we see that being a lot more popular. Languages are changing, the ecosystems are changing, and the granular kind of way to get more forensic analysis is definitely ticking up a lot more.
One thing that's on my radar is complementary to this. It's related to the way that we have various software bill of materials standards out there. For example, there's ISO IEC 5962, SPDX. And one thing that seems to be on the mind of a lot of companies I talk to is the idea that whatever tool you happen to be using, ingest and export of key software bill of materials should be seamless. So if someone wanted to utilize, let's say, SPDX, they should be able to ingest and export SPDX data from different SCA tools if necessary. And this is particularly useful or even an imperative in the supply chain, where you have multiple companies who might internally use one solution, but transfer the data to another entity using another SCA solution. And that's where standardization of the software bill of materials and full fidelity in import and export is top of mind.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things that I'm tracking are certainly regulations crystallizing more. So we've got lots of regulations from all over the world. They're all similar, yet they're all slightly different. So making those becoming more consistent and having more to say around consequences for non-conformance. Right now, a lot of these are kind of best practices and we'd like you to, but there's not a lot of language around what if you don't follow them, what happens? And then certainly SBOM is becoming more granular. I think right now most folks are still and at the package level, trying to wrap their brain around how to automate it, how to make this part of their dev process. So getting more into fragments of code, non-component level elements as SBOM parts in the SBOM, and then starting to think about, well, what does a SaaS bill of material look like as compared to an on-premise product, and what do services look like, and all the various things that bring in risk if they're developed outside your company. So.
I'm not sure if this is a recent trend. In fact, it's kind of not. It's been building for a long time. But once upon a time, the assumption was that open source was approached as an exception to the rule. And I think we're getting to the point where open source actually is the rule and proprietary is the exception. So when we look at software bill of materials, we're just finding more and more open source all the time. And you know, accordingly, I think people are beginning to accept that they need to understand open source licensing issues more, and that it's no longer optional to be able to process open source licensing issues in supply chain anymore.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on Heather's point, historically, almost 50% of the private companies that we've acquired for our buy-side clients don't have a sophisticated understanding of their open source usage. They don't have a consistent program for tracking and managing and building a reliable software bill of materials. And so we almost always find when we do forensic audits of open source usage as part of diligence in an M&A that these clients or these sellers don't have any idea. They really have very little understanding for the most part of what open source they're using and what are the licenses. And so I think the trend that we've seen over the last year and probably will continue is that less mature companies are becoming more compliant and more focused on having a sophisticated program to understand their open source usage and to have a reliable software bill of materials. I think that some of the security vulnerability issues around Log4j and around OpenSSL and others have helped accelerate that trend to people need to understand their usage and have a reliable bill of materials for both license compliance and security. And I think that's helping make people mature faster in terms of implementing real best practices.
So, and I think Heather touched on it, right? This explosion of open source use and third-party component that continues to go up, right? Certainly a major driver behind some of these trends, but what other drivers do you see behind some of these trends that you guys have talked about today?
I think OpenChain adoption is likely playing a big part in this. They're doing an amazing job of outreach. Thankfully, I mean, we have Shane here to talk more on that later, I'm sure. But I mean, it's no surprise that more organizations are taking a closer look at how they manage open source. And then there's a couple of big legal cases as well that are going on right now. But I'll leave that for the lawyers on the panel to comment on if they want. But that could also be driving some of the trends, the recent trends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one thing that Russ was alluding to is there's a case pending right now against Vizio regarding open source compliance, and it's gotten a lot of press in part because of novel legal theories that it's advancing about who has standing to enforce open source licenses and so forth. But the thing I would point out there is that even historically, companies in the consumer electronics space have been the most vulnerable to formal open source compliance claims, mainly because the community enforcers who do enforcement have better access to those products than they do to, say, enterprise software products. So if you're in the consumer electronics space, if you weren't taking open source compliance seriously before, you absolutely have to do it now, because the community compliance organizations are focused on things like consumer electronics, Internet of Things, edge computing products, and so forth. That's always been the most risky area, but it is now even more risky. And depending on what comes out of this lawsuit, it may get much, much more risky.
Anyone else? What about regulations? Is that driving some trends?
Yeah, I've got a note on, I think rather than regulations per se, we're seeing a market trend where areas like the European Union are building out policy regarding digital infrastructure. And this dovetails neatly with things like the US executive order. And I think the industry is perceiving that as a whole, there's going to increasingly being asks in different jurisdictions that you are doing certain things. And this is an imperative to help people align behind international standards. So something like OpenChain as an ISO standard provides a way for the industry to say, look, we're aligning behind this approach on process management. And this helps with the dialogue with policymakers around the world. And we see inclusion of open source standards into government policy. So for example, we've recently had the Japanese government explicitly include OpenChain as the ISO standard for open source license compliance. And that kind of movement, I think, is noticeable around the world. And there's also a lot of, I think, goodwill from governments to try to work closely with the industry on making sure that what's happening in terms of their policy and their guidance to market actually aligns with what the industry itself needs. So rather than a hard touch on the regulatory front where people are getting stuff hitting them and not being ready for it, I think we're looking at an interesting point where the industry is getting quite mature. It's got standards. Government is often around the world looking at this and saying, okay, let's encourage that. Let's align around it. And the end result is that we're moving forward into having things more consistent, more cross-border, and in the end, a lot better for everyone to just get business done.
Real quick, we do have a question in the chat, and I think we probably would maybe touch on this the next segment, but I'm going to go ahead and ask this because we did talk a little bit about SBOMs here. But we've been generating BOM reports for years. Now we can also generate JSON SBOM results. We're trying to understand what to do with these JSON results as a standard. Any thoughts on using these SBOMs? And they note too that any comments is appreciated.
Sure. If you've got the raw material and information, have a look at an existing SBOM standard like SPDX, which is often shared in JSON format, and see if you can align this report material with that ISO standard for software bill of materials. If you can align pre-existing material with a pre-existing standard, you're doing something that avoids reinventing the wheel. What I would caution on would be taking, let's say, a BOM report and trying to make yet another software bill of materials standard, saying, okay, here's what we did, and let's make a new standard out of it. So I'd go the opposite direction. Check if your JSON output aligns neatly with existing market traction SBOMs. And if there's something you're doing that isn't in existing market traction SBOMs, then go over to the projects, tell them, and they're all actively editing and evolving their software bill of materials standards. So you could work together with them based on your market knowledge and experience.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, understand the context you're working in. So look at your supply chain partners. What do your customers expect from you? What standards are they supporting, right? There's several out there. Understand what industry you're in and what the requirements are of that industry, how granular to go. So don't do this in a vacuum. You're going to be part of a larger ecosystem, so try to align as much as possible. But the fact that you've got the raw materials, you're already ahead of many companies. That's great.
I think one other thought there.
Position. Oh, sorry, Russ, go ahead.
I was just going to say one other quick thought there is that it's not clear from the question if you're referring to just open source bill of material versus the new SBOM terminology, which refers to not just open source, but other software as well. So it could be commercial and other third-party non-open source software as well. So if you've got the opportunity, if you've already including that, that's fantastic. If you're not including it, it might be a good idea to start looking at how you could incorporate that into your SBOM.
Yeah, I would actually say that one thing that I'm seeing in the course of audits and due diligence is that it's actually the non-open source third-party software that tends to cause the problems these days more than the open source software does. And so anything you hear about issues with supply chain and so forth, of course, it applies equally to non-open source software. And even the executive orders and the bill that was introduced, or that was, I don't know if it introduced in the Senate before the session ended, they talk about software security in terms of open source, but it actually, of course, security is an issue with all third-party software you're using. And I would say that in the licensing issues these days, I'm actually having more problems to solve with third-party proprietary software than open source.
Very good.
Heather, would you say that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of these proprietary softwares are not, applications are not uncovering the third-party source code that they have within theirs? So, for instance, if they have, you're buying using commercial software and then they're not doing their due diligence to find their open source packages, that's also a threat within that supply.
That can happen, but what I'm seeing more is that developers, the way they work is they just pull in whatever they need. Hey, we lawyers do that too, of course, right? You just pull whatever you need in, and they're some of the stuff that they pull in is freeware or some other kind of proprietary software that they don't have to pay for. So it doesn't go through the procurement process. There's no legal review. And then you end up with proprietary software in your bill of materials that has license restrictions that you can't live with. A common example would be like something that's under an evaluation license, or, has a limitation that then you're actually violating in practice. So you have to be able to identify those things too. Fortunately, there's usually a commercial route to solving that problem, but it can be an expensive route, and all that stuff needs to be identified as well as the open source software.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got another question. How do we get the repositories, open source, and package managers to all deep scan the software they are distributing for licensing and vulnerability and roll those into SBOMs? What's the magic sauce?
By paying them huge amounts of money. I think we're
Commercial
looking at
tools.
Yeah.
yeah,
SCA solutions. Yeah.
SCA solutions indeed. We're looking at a classic problem here, well, a challenge, I should say, in that what you really need to fix is final upstream. But you're the one who really needs to fix it, right? So the project itself might not see an imperative to invest their developer hours into creating the material you need for product to market. So ultimately, if you want your final upstream to have the material you need, you're going to have to underwrite that. And that's something that the industry, I think, is coming to grips with, and we're beginning to see initiatives around it, but we still haven't seen that occur. And the reason for that, it's just money. The people developing the code that you're taking don't necessarily want to do the stuff that you need. So they don't have the fiscal imperative to do that. They don't have a reason to allocate their resources to do that.
Yeah,
But that's the
classic.
ultimate solution.
Classic statement. I downloaded this Docker container from the internet, and I don't have to do open source notices for it, do I?
No, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's okay.
Very good. So, as it relates to these trends, how should security, software development teams, and legal counsel really start to prepare? Is it too late, or what should they, if they haven't started already, what should they be doing?
It's
Well,
never too late. You just
question, I think.
it's never too late. You just have to well, when you're trying to remediate compliance problems, it's a really good idea to triage them in terms of importance. You know, these are the things that we're really worried about, these we're less worried about, or maybe these are things that are easy to knock out quickly, and have a plan for doing that, because realistically, this is the way everybody does compliance. You know, it's never perfect. You find the problems, you try to address the ones you really want to address first, and then have a plan for going forward.
Yeah.
Sorry, Shane, I cut you off.
Go ahead, Shane.
No, I was going to say the same thing. Basically, it's never too late, and for exactly the same point from a different optic is that everything is always going to be on fire. You know, we're always going to be in a massive crisis, and as soon as you put one thing to bed, another thing will take off. So every company is constantly facing pressures to get things done. And this means that whatever you're up to, you'll never be complete. You'll never have finished. You'll never say, okay, this is it. Coffee and cookies, no more work here. So, you know, I would say whatever your status is, either don't worry too much or don't be too confident. The fact is we need continual investment and continual improvement to get these things right.
Yeah, I think, you know, one simple step to start that process is to license a good commercial tool for open source and third-party tracking. You know, just a lot of the companies that we acquire that have no open source compliance program end up suffering a lot of pain at the worst point in their exit, where they're having to do remediation in, you know, retroactively. And so I think, you know, being proactive and incorporating into your DevOps the use of a tool to help you build a reliable software bill of materials is an easy first step. It costs money, and it needs to be managed, and it needs someone you know, to manage it and run it, but it should be done for every build.
Yeah, I would underscore that. Stephen's exactly right. But to say that if you're running a business of any reasonable size, you need a tool to manage this information. It is very difficult to manage manually. And also when you have to do things like create licensing notices and so forth, that is a ton of thankless, boring work to do unless you have a tool to help you do it. Well, it's still thankless and boring, but it's less time consuming. Like the companies that are managing their open source by like filling out a spreadsheet manually, if you're of any size at all, you need to be doing better than that, and you need to think about getting a tool. Open source is a big information problem to solve. You know, it's like, it's wonderful, but the price of using it is managing that information, and you need tools to manage it. Human beings are not terribly good at managing it.
Yeah, and to back up to point on that is that, as a services team, we always ask for a notices report when we first started engagement, be it an M&A or a baseline audit. And usually those are about 20% of what the actual outcome is about one of our scans. It's 80% new findings. Having people manage that is definitely not something that especially larger organizations can really manage. Even small organizations, 4 or 5 employees, is difficult to deal with. I would also say just starting some sort of education program, understanding and setting policies with the organization, even without a tool, understanding that, GPL, you're allergic to GPL. A lot of organizations don't even know that, but just having those basic fundamental understandings is a good way to even start out for just a smaller organization as well.
One thing that humans rarely do correctly in this process is include all the dependencies, excuse me, that the open source has.
Yeah, and I'd say along with a tool, right? It's important to figure out your process. So, adopt OpenChain, adopt part of OpenChain, whatever is reasonable for you at this current time. Make sure you have a policy in place, right? It doesn't benefit you to do all the scanning, build all this data, and then not do anything with it. So understand how you're going to process it, how often you're going to scan, what you're going to scan, what's out of scope. Don't kind of go in trying to solve every problem on the first pass of this. So be realistic, kind of adjust, measure, and make sure that all this work produces a benefit for you and your customers. Otherwise, kind of redefine what you're doing and make sure that it's focused effort, because it will take effort from people, and you want to make sure you're producing business value.
That's a really good point. And I always like to say that when it comes to approaching solving any problem, and it can be frustrating, but you start at the highest level and you work out what's the framework we apply, and then you know where to slot in the most appropriate solution, be it, let's say, personal analysis, automation, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm quite a big fan of architecting a solution as opposed to implementing stuff, because there's always a cost to implementing stuff and having imperfect fits. And that usually comes back to bite you in terms of time and resources later. By the way, I saw we have some further follow-up about how do we scan repositories and stuff. So Chris Wood, hey Chris, had some notes about this stuff. He's playing devil's advocate on the cost of, let's say, having final upstream, having proper SBOMs. He's got a note here. Why should commercial software companies have to bear the cost of tools and tens of thousands of hours of analysis for things like repositories and package managers to have proper SBOM material? So I would roll with just money. If you want to make money out of this stuff, then you have to invest money into it. And if you're taking the code, unless that person's monetizing the code and saying, hey, here's a market deliverable right here, then the reason that commercial companies have to bear the cost is because they're the commercial party taking this to market and leveraging it. So I'm just pure play economics on this. And I think that if you're making money off something and you're taking it from somewhere where someone is not providing you with a commercial contract on that delivery, they're just saying, here's my project, then it's your responsibility to deal with that product delivery to market, not them.
Yeah, I would also point out that people ask me, at least all the time, how can you make money like producing open source software? And since that's what my venture fund does, this actually points up a really important point about that. The product is more than just the source code, right? So actually, you can make money by providing things like professional packaging, bill of materials, etc. And that's actually kind of the Red Hat model, right? I mean, is that you can take open source code and turn it into a professional product, and people will pay you for that. And they'll pay you for that because this is actually work and you're solving a problem for them. Now, that's not the only way you make money using open source software, but it's an important distinction between just kind of the raw source code and the project and a product that's been professionally put together with all the meta information and, according to all of the standards.
That's a really good point, Heather. And touching on that, building on that, I'll give a concrete market example of something that's happening right now. In the vehicle space, there's an interest in using Linux-based technology deeper into cars, but there's a challenge with Linux-based technology because it's not functional safety certified. So there's a standard called ISO 26262. Now, Red Hat is shopping around that they will have a functional safety certified version of Linux available shortly. So in automotive terms, that's probably a couple of years out. But the automotive companies are being pitched on this, and they're interested because instead of having, let's say, a QNX to run functional safety systems on the car, they could run Linux and it would be functional safety certified. Now, obviously, Red Hat is going to monetize that, and the car companies would pay for that because someone's doing the heavy lifting on the functional safety and managing that. And I think to Heather's point, when you want a delivery that meets various requirements, be it SBOM or functional safety, that's a point of commercialization. And if there's no commercialization on that, you're just taking the raw code, then in essence, you're taking that challenge to yourself. And I think that's fair in the market. That's kind of a really clear commercial transaction. And it's the type of compromise that should be reasonable for companies to put into their normal analysis in cost benefit.
I think it's a little bit of an aside, but Shane's point about the automotive industry and just vehicles in general, we've noticed a lot of clients in the early phases and late phases using a lot of open source on the automobile or the autonomous flying vehicle or whatever is the vehicle. And they have a pretty limited appreciation that when they sell that vehicle, they're going to be distributing that open source. And so, I think companies in that space need to understand that, when you sell a vehicle and it has a server in the trunk and there's open source, then you're making a distribution, and all of the requirements in an open source license that flow from a distribution are triggered and you have to comply.
I'm sorry, guys, I'm going to step in here. They're all great. I want to go on to our next theme just to make sure that we've got time to get through all of our questions and our themes, but great discussion. That was perfect. So theme number 2, the evolving role of the software bill of materials. So what I'd like to do first is start by getting an update on what's happened in the last few months with the executive order. Maybe Alex, could you kind of get us started there?
Sure, I can kind of give the Cliff Notes version here because there's lots that's been going on. So executive order was issued back in May of 2021. It was kind of an overarching goal of overall improving the cybersecurity in U.S. government. And it had several sections in there, some procedural, some tactical, some around tooling. One of the sections really talked about software bill of material as a way to provide more transparency into the software that the U.S. government purchases. So over the next year or so, NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was tasked with 2 things. One was to collaborate with industry, private sector, academia, and others, and come up with best practices, tooling requirements, guidelines, and ultimately a document writing up the suggested process, along with starting up a labeling effort. So similar to the Energy Star label on your appliances, that they are energy efficient. The idea is that we will label software that it is more trustworthy having the label than not having the label. So similar to OpenChain in that they are following the right procedures and right application security measures to make sure that when you are purchasing the software that you have more confidence that they've done the right work to improve the chances that you will not have a security vulnerability. Since then, so about a little year and a half later or so, CISA, which is Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency in the U.S. government, has taken over SBOMs. They are further maturing it. There are weekly calls to talk about SBOM standards, use cases, tooling development, and so forth. So that is an activity that's going on. And then in mid-September, Office of the President released a memo that essentially said that we are now going to start enforcing this. And agencies are now required to comply with NIST security guidelines. CISA is now charged with publishing updated SBOM standards and requirements going into attestations, which is essentially companies making statements that their software should be trustworthy because they run the appropriate process. So that is starting in January of next year. And then federal agencies are required to start implementing these guidelines over the next couple of years. starting with assessing all the software that they've purchased in the past. So lots of motion, lots of things going on, lots of agencies in play. And again, kind of the challenge is lots of voices, lots of discussions, lots of industry groups. So how does all this kind of crystallize into, if I'm selling to the government specifically, what do I need to do? And when do I need to do it? So that's kind of where we are today.
Very good. So with all this said, and I think we started to hear it in some of the questions that we got in that first segment, but is the SBOM a panacea really for managing the security of the software supply chain? Is it the ultimate fix?
No, not even remotely. It's just a thing. It's just a tool. Like software itself, an SBOM is just a screwdriver or a hammer. Everything depends on implementation. And that means process management and how you apply those processes to bringing product to market. So an SBOM is one measure that allows a certain type of insight and consistency of insight, depending on you doing other stuff too, like having a good policy in place, having good automation in place, and so on. But it's an important part. And if you get the SBOM right, it's going to make your life a lot easier.
What does it and what doesn't it do, Shane? What needs to be done in addition to SBOM management?
I would say that the SBOM itself gives you a structured way to access information about what you're using. So it lets you know what's there. What is it? What version is it? Where did it come from? And what terms does it have, or what applies to it? So what license applies to it, or what, for instance, security vulnerabilities apply to it. So it gives you that identification matrix to get you started. But once you have the information about that software that either you ingest or you're about to ship, you have to have things that you do with that information. And that's where SBOM ends, and you're on to another aspect of managing your security.
Yeah, I mean, one key example of that is you need to be able to use your SBOM in order to generate a list of the software that you're distributing for purposes of complying with the attribution conditions of many of the open source licenses. So, at the highest level, an open source license is a conditional license that says, I'll give you a license to my copyrighted software so long as, or on the condition that you meet these obligations. And the conditions are often that you give attribution to me for the software that you're using in your product. And the SBOM doesn't do that itself. And you need tools to be able to generate that list of attributions that you then have to pass on to your end customer.
Actually, I was super excited, Kendra, when we were prepping for this and you had that question. I thought this is the best part. So, once you get started with these things, you can do a lot with a good SBOM. But if a company just has an SBOM and no particular idea what they're doing with it, their security remains zero, effectively. So definitely not a panacea, but a very important part of a structured solution. And one of the challenges we've had in market, and this is something that Heather mentioned, is the curse of the spreadsheets. And there's an adjacent curse, which is everyone has a different SBOM, negating the ability of SBOMs to do anything in particular. So, this is where the industry is finally maturing, and we're providing the type of solutions that will actually allow us to do better and better and iterate on security. Final note before I hand over to my colleagues is just that security itself is never an endpoint. It's always a process, right? So the SBOM is useful for the continual management of security, which is always going to be a moving target. No matter what you do, you will never solve security around software. What you're doing is you're continually reducing your risk vectors, and you're doing remediation to try to make things manageable. And the SBOM you could regard as one of the foundations of doing that in a consistent manner. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah,
So
every time I get this question, the way I look at it is, so the SBOM is kind of the end result of what's inside your product. But if you didn't take time during design, during development, during build, during test, during deployment, it will enumerate what's in there, but you still introduce security problems along the way. So it's, to Shane's point, it's a journey, it's a process. Don't be fooled thinking you're going to ship with zero vulnerabilities and it'll remain with zero vulnerabilities. It's not going to happen. So it's all about prioritization, making sure that you do security as far to the left as possible, that developers are trained, that they understand why they're involved in the process. and it has to be a culture on the team. It can't just be, we're going to build a particular document and that's going to solve all of our problems.
So what about VDR and VEX relative to the software bill of materials? Shane and Alex, can you maybe comment on that?
Sure. So all kind of politics aside, I'll stick to what the intent of them is, right? There's kind of lots of opinions on the value of them, but simplest way I can explain it. So VDR is your vulnerability disclosure report. It is essentially a public version of what hopefully companies are doing internally, which is we did a scan, we identified we're using 1,000 things. Out of 1,000, 100 of them have vulnerabilities. Which ones impact us? Which ones don't? What's the severity? Are there ways to mitigate it? What do we tell our customers about it? So it's kind of a public version of that. It's here's everything related to my product. VEX is more around prioritization and focusing on what is relevant. So it is more of a report of false positives, things that, although associated to the components you use, are not necessarily exploitable in your product, either because the way your product is constructed, which functions it may use of an open source component, how it's deployed, if it's behind the firewall, for example. Perhaps there's less exploitation vectors than if it's a hosted solution. So these are just two tools that ideally are related to, but outside of your SBOM, because they age out very quickly. Your SBOM is static, kind of release to release until you update your components. Your security reports are going to change all the time. So you want them to be referenced and live and not necessarily embedded as part of your bill of materials. So two tools to understand the security exposures for the parts that your SBOM will enumerate.
I think one way to look at it, which is just really lining up with what Alex said, is that the SBOM tells you what's in play, and then other things like your VDR tells you what that means right now. Okay, so that gives you the insight of what that means for you right now. But because security is such a fast-moving field, things are both fixed and broken constantly. Something like the SBOM is not going to give you that insight into today's crisis is this, but it will provide the data to get you started in having that insight. The market confusion that may emerge is that some SBOMs are targeting themselves towards the security domain. So you might begin to think, oh, does that overlap or replace something else to do with security? And the answer is no. A software bill of materials is a bill of materials of what that software is. It's a list of this software with these things, these terms happening to it. And monitoring, let's say, continuous vulnerability analysis is a slightly different thing to solve. So end result, I'd say any good software bill of materials should provide you the foundation to begin doing things like a vulnerability analysis on top of. But no bill of materials is really intended to be that kind of dynamic document listing today's security crises. It's intended to be a library of what material is here. What did we just ingest? What did we just export? And from there, you do your analysis with other appropriate tools.
So what needs to happen, do we think, to SBOMs in the future to get everyone to buy into the importance of producing and managing SBOMs? What do we have to do? Because I think it's on more organizations and more departments' radar. Obviously, that's gaining some traction, but I don't think we're there yet on getting all of that buy-in. What do we need to do?
We got to do something. Everyone should be doing something. Too many companies are kind of waiting and seeing here, I think. But start with the open source you know that you're using, whether you've got the tooling to support that yet or not. Maybe you disagree with SBOM formatting, or you feel like there hasn't been enough direction provided by the regulators in the space. I think the basics of an SBOM are reasonably understood by most folks. It's important, again, to start somewhere, even if that means starting with just the identification of your software components and versions. You could start out with an SBOM proof of concept on a single product internally, like within your own organization for now, at least until you work out some of the process kinks and nuances, technical limitations, etc. But that at least gives you a starting point to learn from and then scale up from.
Anyone else? There's a comment in our chat addressed the fact that SBOM helps to manage the risk from vulnerabilities, security, but unless done correctly, doesn't directly address attestations from a licensing perspective. The executive order is silent on copyright and licensing.
Right. So I think what Chris is touching on here is an interesting point in that if you are doing, let's say, your security analysis and you've got that in play already, then if your SBOM does the base identification of what package is in play, you'll immediately be able to apply your security analysis. But if you don't have a license compliance framework in place, then the SBOM let's say the SBOM just identifies the software package. That doesn't tell you what your license compliance obligations are. Now, some SBOMs do. For instance, the SPDX standard includes fields for including license information, but that doesn't mean that people will have done that. For instance, if a company had just read the US executive order and said, I'll follow that, then they might completely omit all the licensing information because it's not part of that executive order. So yeah, I think Chris touches on an interesting point in that not all SBOMs are created equally, including the same SBOM standard. It really depends on how you're using it. And we're back to the fact that it's just a tool. And that tool really depends on how you're using it. And if you're not architecting a solution, if you don't have an optic into all of the issues you want to solve here, you might leave out stuff that turns out to be pretty important later. And one example, just building off Chris's thing, is that if you're solving for, let's say, an SBOM and security, and you forget your license obligations, then you enter into M&A talks, and your acquirer has a look and says, do you own any of your code? Have you been distributing all of this code with the permission? And you're like, I don't know. Which is a surprisingly common problem.
Yeah, I'd say also kind of to Shane's point, if you are building an SBOM, understand who's going to consume it. We find, we've got a feature to ingest SBOMs in our product, and we are struggling all the time because most SBOMs don't conform to any standard, right? They claim to be an SPDX or CycloneDX document, but they don't pass any validators. So the specs keep being refined. They keep adding more attributes to it. So kind of do your consumers a favor and validate that what you've produced is actually readable and that someone will benefit from ingesting it. To Stephen's point, all I hear about is people talking about SBOMs. They've stopped talking about attribution and third-party notices and things like that. So I do see at some point convergence between them where you produce one document that has it all. And although there are optional fields that would support that today in both standards, most people don't populate them. So I think that's going to be a best practice that will help is put all your attributions into the document. Everything's in one place. Everything's machine readable. Then it's just a matter of transforming it into whatever you need to get out of it.
Yeah, no, and it's very often a difficult manual process just to identify the license for each of the packages, because people on GitHub have various levels of diligence in terms of posting what license they're distributing under. And so, having a tool that helps identify what it is the license then will help you comply with the attribution conditions. And some of these licenses require you also to give your end user a copy of the license. And so you need to be able to generate that attributions document and know, which of the licenses require you to also give a copy of the license along with your documentation.
Yeah, most of the licenses that are out there in the wild today, unfortunately, were written, many of them were written pre-web and they were, and none of them really take into account sort of modern notions of conveying licensing information in a supply chain. It would be nice if the licenses had more forgiving notice requirements. What most of them literally require is delivering a plain text copy of the license, which arguably is not terribly useful to the recipient to find out what software is in the product. And companies struggle all the time with, am I going to follow the requirements of the letter of the license and just dump tons of text files on a recipient, or am I going to sort and deliver the information in a useful way? And I find that many of my clients are, very surprised to hear that it's not okay to just put all the information on a website, because That's not exactly what the licenses require. However, depending on the product that you're actually distributing, it can be a useful approach, but you have to understand what the risks are for kind of footfalls associated with not doing exactly what the licenses tell you. So we've got a fair amount of tension between what the licenses actually say you have to do and what really makes sense either in a commercial environment or what makes sense for the recipient to ingest the information.
Yeah. No, I recently reviewed, in fact, yesterday reviewed an attributions document for a piece of hardware that goes into telecom data centers, and the software attributions document that was generated by a fairly sophisticated set of tools was 1,560 pages of PDF.
It's a lot of reading to do.
Yeah.
Especially in a PDF.
Right. Most of it was just, duplicate copies of the CDDL and the GPL version 2.
Yeah. If I could tie together a point that I think Stephen and Shane were making, I think organizations might consider taking a more holistic approach to this problem of how does an SBOM go together, or how might you contribute all these elements to an SBOM, because they require different elements of expertise. So I don't think it can be just security, just the OSPO, or just the dev teams on their own. Again, it's more likely to require multiple contributors within an organization. So, you could consider this like a system level problem where SBOM management is just one part of a bigger system that manages your overall use of open source or software more broadly. So elements of that system could be those same groups, security, OSPO, dev teams, for example, and then they contribute towards their areas of expertise in the SBOM. So you might have the OSPO identifying open source, and security would be reporting of vulnerabilities, and the OSPO would help with license compliance. The dev teams might contribute other information regarding non-open source third-party software and any commercial licensing that might be in play. And then someone or some function in this system would then be tasked with pulling together or aggregating all of this data that they can assemble the SBOM. But at least that way it's been put together by some of the organization's expertise that they specialize in those areas. So aggregating it might be a simpler task than having a person in security trying to go out and figure the compliance side, or the OSPO trying to go figure the security side. It may not work for everybody.
It sounds like, right, it's a more strategic approach to management, right, across the board, and setting your policies. So we do also have a question with a bit of a comment. My humble opinion is an SBOM may not be able to completely fulfill all license obligations. My question, or my doubt in this person, is how do we ensure SBOMs also fulfill all license obligations?
An SBOM isn't meant to fulfill license obligations. Right. It's just meant to tell you what those obligations are. So I think that's a definition that we need to put on the table straight away. The SBOM will tell you what you have to do. The SBOM's job is not to necessarily do it. So different licenses require different things. And what you'll have with the SBOM is identification that you have this, and this license in play. You still need processes inside your company for how you address the requirements of those licenses. It's a separate matter from identifying that those licenses exist.
Yeah, I would also, my somewhat flippant answer is if you get some software that has a true attribution requirement, meaning something in addition to a license notice, put an issue on GitHub and ask them to change the license to something that doesn't have the attribution requirement, because it's really actually not consistent with best practices in open source licensing these days. And you'll see that some of the more popular projects that have been under licenses that have these advertising requirements are actually moving to more standard licenses like Apache and so forth. You usually find those in older projects, which is not to say that they're not important. Often those projects have been around for a long time because people really like using them, but some of the licenses have gotten out of sync with best practices at this point.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think Heather touched on something twice now, which is really important. It's that a lot of the stuff that's in play in open source is outdated. The market has moved on substantially. So the licenses that were brought into play in the, let's say, early 90s don't necessarily reflect how we're doing business today. And you could arguably say, well, hey, that doesn't matter. It does matter. The thing is that companies understand that they're using, sharing, adapting technology, and they're very happy to play with the open source rules. But what we're doing today is so dramatically different from when a lot of these licenses were drafted that it's a little problematic to manage them in the supply chain. So we have this legacy issue, which always happens with software. I mean, you turn around and you find software that's 40, 50, 60 years old in place still. It's imperfect, and there's a lot of friction because of it. And I think we just have to say that it's unfortunate. And when we do new stuff, or when we can change stuff, it's worth looking at that. And if you can relicense something that would be usefully relicensed, why not? There's no harm to that. Anything that makes business better, anything that makes development easier. So I think we should always be very flexible and understand that we get open source. Open source is one. The legacy stuff can be a headache, and if we can find better solutions, great. If not, we need to manage the legacy stuff. So it's just important to have good processes for that.
Okay. So I mentioned, right, that citation I pulled from Forbes earlier about the software supply chain is everyone's business, right? But there are certain industries that really jump out at us when we talk about the software supply chain and software supply chain security, SBOM management, sectors like the government and automotive and medical device manufacturers, right? Where, sometimes, it impacts human life, right? Why should these sectors really take the lead in kind of software supply chain security and SBOM management?
Because they've got the most to lose, right? I mean, it's potential impact of a serious breach or a functional compromise, right? If your car gets hacked in and you're driving on the freeway at 70 miles an hour, that's more impactful than if your smart hair dryer gets compromised, right? So you just have to look at the impact of it, right? If you're dealing with control software for infrastructure, water supply, things like that, the impact of somebody taking over and changing the composition of chemicals, whatever we've seen in the past, that's significant. So that requires more attention in that industry. So it's just impact to human harm and what's the consequence if something is hacked.
Yeah, I would say it's obviously accountability and safety concerns, but these are also really mature industries, right? That probably already have really well-established protocols in place that kind of leads them to be kind of the leader in it. Due to that, they probably already have a lot of functionality in place before other organizations or other industries would have.
And as it happens, we have a comment from Chris, which touches on that kind of some industries are deeper than others in what they're up to. And Chris is just noting that his company's been preparing a licensing SBOM, which embeds all the licenses and notices. And I know that Chris's industry is very heavy on this. It's one of those industries that really has very strict requirements. And I think that's a good example where some industries are already pre-prepped to do an excellent job. It's second nature to them. Now, when it comes to open source, they mightn't yet have processes in place for this. They might be coming at this and saying, okay, how do we get this same great stuff in open source? What's different? And the answer is usually not a lot is different, just a few things. And you can pick up a lot of information that you need for process adjustment, if any, very quickly from our communities, because we do tend to just throw everything out for free on the internet and say, hey, use it. But yeah, critical industries have the most to lose. And I remember a few years ago conversations in industries like medical. Now, I'm getting old, so this is quite a long time when I say a few years ago. But there was a point where you talked at medical, and medical was like, that open source thing, that's crazy. Who would use that? And now you've got these incredibly complex medical robots running Linux. So I think that there's this perceptive thing that something like open source and then open source process management could be a hindrance to critical industries. But it's not, and open source is everywhere. Critical industries are positioned to have great process management anyway. and they simply need to adjust those specific to open source, if any, that apply to their product distribution.
Okay, very good. So time to move on to our last and final theme 3, real world OSS governance with OpenChain best practices. Shane, this is probably an obvious one for our audience, but I'm going to ask you to kind of start us off. Can you give us the story behind the story? What prompted OpenChain to create and release the security assurance reference guide, for example?
Okay, so pulling back, the original reason we went to market with OpenChain on license compliance around 2016 was because when it came to the supply chain, we were looking at it and thinking, where does trust in the open source supply chain tend to break down quite a lot? And license compliance was a key answer. People were seeing a huge amount of license compliance issues to market. So it became very clear that the correct solution to that was to have a unified approach to addressing license compliance. And that's why we built a standard for the process management of open source license compliance. That went from a de facto standard in 2016 to an ISO standard in 2020. And this was quite a good maturity. It made a lot of progress. In fact, as of last year, we had a survey 2021 done by PwC and Bitkom in Germany. And it showed us that from the companies surveyed, 20% of the entities with 2,000 or more employees were already using the license compliance standard in market. So nice traction, nice movement around the world. The reason was simple. To solve license compliance, we needed aligned processes, and the best and quickest way to do it across the supply chain was to have that one standard so we'd know what everyone is doing. That would help reduce any problems and it would make remediation a lot quicker. When it came to security, the exact same optic was in play. A lot of people were saying that open source security process management wasn't great. A lot of their suppliers, for example, weren't doing a lot and were trying to get up to speed. And the question was, should everyone do their own thing or should we try to standardize on some basic approaches? We found that the license compliance standard, which had been in market for a while and was, let's say, battle proven, was picked up by companies who were looking at security optics, and they started using that-ish for security. So our community naturally said, well, let's talk about that. Let's make a guide about what's useful from the license compliance optic with the security perspective. And then our community said, and let's talk about what's missing. And after a while, they essentially forked the license compliance standard, removed the license compliance specific bits, added security specific bits, and voila, we have a security sister standard to the license compliance standard. All of this is situation normal for open source development, and naturally being an open source standard for open source process management, we're doing exactly the same as our community normally does, which is finding something that's a challenge, trying to find the best solution, bring it to market. The entire concept, all the way from license compliance to the recent release of a de facto security assurance specification, is what's the absolute simplest process management approach that companies can take to solve a domain problem like license compliance or security from the optic of making a more trusted supply chain. What's the minimum we need to do to get started? And the goal, of course, is to lift all the boats. Some companies are truly excellent at compliance and security and everything else. A lot of companies are not. So what we want to do is try to lift everyone to a level where things are working better. And that's what we've been up to. That's why we recently released that security specification, and why we're running that into ISO as well, which will hopefully join our ISO standard for license compliance. We expect to have an ISO standard for security assurance mid-2023. That's what we're up to. It's going pretty well. We see a lot of enthusiasm, and we see a lot of global activity too. Often when something's happening in open source, we've tended to see stuff occurring quite often in, let's say, North America. With something like the OpenChain project, where we've addressed license compliance for years, now working on security, we've seen a very global approach. For instance, when we released self-certification materials for the security assurance specification, Within 18 hours, one of the organizations under the Chinese Ministry of Trade, CAICT, had translated those materials and started to share them in the Chinese market as well for companies that wanted to self-certify.
Yeah. Wow. Very good. So, and I think you really started to touch on this in terms of why this is so important, and maybe, why license compliance and security and these guidelines are so important. But I think I'd like to hear from the others too. We've laid a foundation here. Why are these guidelines so important today?
I mean, it simplifies the basic elements that a good program should have, or a good process that it should have. I mean, it tells you, one of the nice things about the OpenChain specification and standard is that it tells you what you should have, but it's up to each organization to determine how it gets implemented according to their almost always unique scenarios.
Anyone else? No.
Yeah, I mean, I think it plugs the holes, right? You can't deal with licenses and forgets about security. You can't deal with security, forget about licenses. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. You got to get all the stakeholders together. So it's important to have best practices for both perspectives. And kind of at the heart of it all is you can't do either one unless you got your bill of material. You need to know what components you have to be able to secure both, kind of the vulnerability side of it as well as comply with licenses. So it works nicely on both sides.
Yeah, and I have a couple of...
sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, in the tooling space, I think it's very important to standardize the bill of materials so that people can build tools that will use that information to generate, for example, an attributions document. So if you have everybody creating a bill of materials that meets a standard, it's much easier to develop a one-to-many solution as a tool to help those companies then generate their license compliance documentation.
I'll make a somewhat cynical comment, which is if you're at your company and you're trying to convince a company to engage in proper open source compliance processes, the way to do it is usually to explain to them, just as you've heard a few times already, that license issues and security issues go hand in hand. And in fact, most of the tools that help you address those issues do both licensing and security review, or many of them do. So the way to get action within your organization is to say, we need to do this in order to make the product secure, because that is something that it's easier to convince a C-suite that the product needs to be secure than that it needs to be compliant with open source licenses. It's the C-suite might view a little bit differently.
Just the nature of the beast there, right, Heather? Yeah.
And I would roll with, why are we doing all of this stuff? It's a very important business question that goes beyond the issues we see at play. For instance, the US executive order got a lot of attention from US companies, but quite frankly, a lot of the world couldn't care less. And as it should be, each jurisdiction, each administration does different things and stuff happens. In the market spaces, people do different things and stuff happens. There's very few constants in business, except one, which is that companies are here to make money. And one of the challenges around managing any software is that if you're not efficient in your processes, you're wasting resources, you're burning money. When it comes to something like license compliance or security, we have optics of it's legally required. Or for instance, there's regulations that are pushing it in certain jurisdictions, or customer trust, et cetera, et cetera. What it all boils down to in the end is that either you get these things as efficient as possible, or you're leaving money on the table. And I think that with the supply chain management in OpenChain, it's always been front of mind for me that ultimately we're dealing with a business optimization challenge. We have motivations to do it, like law or like regulations, but what we're actually doing is we're making stuff more efficient, more effective, cheaper. And I think that when it comes to choosing standards and pushing for consistency, that's part of the same narrative as well. You're looking at how do you make sure that that entire supply chain is operating as effectively as possible to solve this domain problem. So I like to have that optic as we frame what we're doing and as we push what we're doing. And I've noticed that sometimes inside companies, people sideline issues like process management around open source compliance, or in the past, open source security, though now with the fires going on, that's reprioritized. But people would sideline these things as, yeah, that's nice, but it's not product to market. Well, it might not seem like product to market today, but it can be product slow to market. And that's why I think we should always look at having C-level fully appraised of why optimization is a key issue in this domain, as with every other aspect of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly can be product to market, as well as you began to touch on a little bit, revenue loss, right, or bottom line impact. Those discussions are worth having, and when we're talking about license compliance and security, for sure. So how should security and license compliance guidelines evolve as technology continues to innovate, and certainly threat actors continue to find a way, as we've just learned over the last few months with OpenSSL, with other security and vulnerabilities that we dealt with over the last year?
I would just roll with, this is always going to be an iteration game. And we can't predict exactly what will happen next. All we can say is that things will change. So we need to have process management that's adaptable, that we come back to and double check over time. We need to, as organizations, be flexible with that evolution. And just to be cognizant that the goal here is to be using as few resources as possible to cover as many bases as possible. So that's what we're up to, a series of continual improvement considerations. So it comes right back to Toyota's Kaizen here. Just continually iterate, continually improve, continually involve to make sure that you're doing the appropriate thing for your market domain.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo the same side on the consumer side, right? So it's, train your people, make them aware, and just keep putting more efficiencies into the product, and keep doing retrospectives and keep squeezing out more efficiencies, right? You're never done. So you just want to keep getting better over time.
We do have a note real quick from Chris. Thank you, Chris, for your participation today. Echoing Russ and Shane's great observations, and I think this is just a statement. My company has been preparing a full deep licensing SBOM for more than 20 years on our program, which includes a full copy of the license and all notices. We need an SPDX SBOM tool that does both at the end of the software built on both requirements. So, and I apologize if I missed that earlier. Okay, so how does then the security addition to the OpenChain guidance integrate to the existing license compliance content?
It doesn't. So it's a separate standard. Mm-hmm. So there's two standards in play. They're sister standards. So if you are using the license compliance standard, it's a small lift to go into the security side too. You're looking at a couple of additional process points. Mm-hmm. And that's on purpose. Basically, the idea here is there's some fundamental processes like know what you're bringing in, know mm-hmm. what you're putting out. And then there's a few specific things like if you're in a license compliance optic, know what the license is. If you're in a security optic, know what the security vulnerability is. So very close sister standards. They're not the same, but they're something that you can work with. They're both light touches, and they're both designed so that your company can get started with that as the basis of a program and build up from there using more complex, more detailed standards for different domains. Like let's say, I need functional safety, et cetera, et cetera. So these are light touch process standards. Each one is about 7 pages long. And self-certification for most companies will take a few minutes and might flag some things that are missing, which might take you a little longer to get into play.
If you're conformant with the license compliance piece, do you have to recertify?
To the security? Yeah.
Yep.
And again, it's just a checklist. Ideally, when you look at the checklist for the security thing, it should be a case of, yep, we got it. If it's a case of no, we don't have it, that means that you're missing something with your known vulnerability identification or reporting. So it's a good idea to put that in place. So really, you can think of it this way. These process standards are designed to help do the things that we know will solve the largest challenges as cheaply as possible. If you hit an item on either standard that you don't have in play, it's a good idea to introduce that because it's a well-known failure point. And the exact way that you introduce a process content to address it is flexible. Like Russ said, it depends on your company. And our recommendation is this. If you're looking at these standards and there's something you don't have, start with the absolute simplest implementation of that. Start as small as possible. And then gradually over time, you can make a more and more sophisticated process, but keep it really simple. I'll give you the simplest stupid example possible. Let's say there's a requirement, tell people about your open source policy in the standard for license compliance, which there is. And let's say you forgot to tell your employees that you have an open source policy. Well, it's probably time to send an email. If you send that email, you've just done the first iteration of that process. Good work. So that's the kind of thinking we like to see in the market.
That simplistic approach, right? Okay. All right. I just want to remind our audience, we do have a few minutes left here before we start closing things out. If you have any last minute questions, please feel free to type those in and we'll be sure to get them addressed. Okay. All right. So I think that concludes all of our themes. I want to thank all of our speakers today and our panelists. Just a great job. Before we close it out, I'd like to go around the table one more time and ask each of our panelists to maybe provide a key takeaway. We talked about a lot today, right? There was a lot to cover. So what was a key takeaway from today's discussion that you perhaps want our audience to walk away with? So if we can do maybe 30 seconds each, that would be great. Shane, could you get us started?
Sure. My key takeaways are, first of all, the market has a lot of knowledge in play. Second of all, that knowledge can seem daunting to people because it sometimes sounds like a lot of stuff has been done that, let's say, I don't know about or you don't know about. And three, that's not the case at all. We have a great community where people share their knowledge freely, just like on this conversation. And every project you go to, like the OpenChain project or SPDX for software bill of materials, will provide you with all of the information you need to get started. So in summary, my takeaway is that there's plenty of information at fingertips ready for you. There's plenty of support ready for you in this market. And the important thing is that if you're missing something, take that first step, do something small to get started, and that's enough. You can iterate from there and continually improve from there with the help of your peers around the world.
That's great advice, right? Take that first step, get started. Right. Russ?
Sure. So, I'll tie this back to something I spoke about earlier. And I think everyone's talked about inventory or identifying your open source. But if you've heard me speak at any other events, you've most likely heard me say that you can't comply with, secure, or remediate any open source that you aren't aware that you're using. So in real estate, everyone's familiar with the expression location, location, location. In open source, it should be inventory, inventory, inventory. Once you have that, it helps you with security, open source compliance, SBOM, potentially export controls, and so many other areas. So just simply writing a policy in a vacuum, not sending it out, like Shane said, and expecting that everyone follows it has never worked. At least not effectively.
Good, thank you. Stephen?
Sure. I think we've touched on, the legal risk of failing to know what you're using and complying with the licenses. For private companies especially, but for all companies, it's also very important to understand that failing to know what open source you're using and have a reliable bill of materials and failing to comply with the license requirements can really impact your valuation and create huge headaches and deal uncertainty risk at the time of your exit when you're most vulnerable. And you don't want to be in a situation of having to remediate open source non-compliance between signing and closing of your main exit event.
Very good. Thank you. Marcus?
Yeah, we'll kind of move with what everyone else is saying is that, you may have a software bill of materials, knowing that those things can change over time. Vulnerabilities can hit you later on. You have a SBOM that says you have, let's say zlib or something. Vulnerabilities can come out in the future that may come at you. So being diligent about paying attention to what you have and being aware of the market and know what's happening around you. And also knowing that licenses change over time. Something that could be Apache could easily change to a much more viable license. And being aware of those changes is really important for your organization. And another thing is, having this SBOMs and being aware of having these kind of toolings not only makes you, it makes you also a valuable asset. So if your company is going to be acquired, in the future, having that, knowing it just makes you a better asset, makes you much more valuable to know that you're already in the field, paying attention and making sure that you're marketable and that you're securing yourself through licensing and security.
Very good. Great point. Heather.
Yeah. So open source compliance issues are typically not actually high dollar risks. And yet people in transactions are very afraid of open source issues. I think mainly because they, you fear what you don't know. But as you can tell from the discussion today, if you have problems, there's a lot of work to do to solve the issues. It's not like a patent lawsuit where you're going to get sued for zillions of dollars. But you may find yourself very unhappy at having to shore up your processes quickly in order to resolve the issues. So I would say, don't be afraid of open source issues, but do get processes in place sooner rather than later, because the main issue you're going to face when you have an open source problem is having to backfill your processes, and that'll cause delays and distraction and cause transactions to go sideways. And those, while they are not big sort of damages, big ticket damages issues, they're definitely issues that you want to avoid.
Very good. And Alex.
Yeah, I echo everything everybody else said. I would say just don't be intimidated, right? To Shane's point, there's lots of people out there that are willing to help. There's lots of content, just have to go find it. There's lots of meetings, so engage, right? Every single industry group we talked about has recurring meetings. There's lots of information sharing, lots of experts that are very open about the knowledge they have. And the second point I'd make is just understand what's expected of you in the industry you're in, right? Don't waste your time on things that your customers aren't expecting from you, and instead, not focus on things they do need from you. So if you're selling to the government, or if you're in a regulated industry, or if you're working on consumer electronics, understand what it is that will make your customers' life easier, or your partners or your customers, and focus on that and prioritize, and don't try to boil the ocean with your first attempt to do any of this stuff. So break it up, don't do it alone, build a team internally, get everybody's buy-in, and then just keep chipping away and getting better over time.
Yeah, very good. Because if it's perceived as this big giant thing to conquer, right, it's hard to take that first step, and it does not have to be that. So
yep, absolutely.
Very good. Great wrap up, everyone. Thank you so much, panelists. To our audience, look for future open source exchanges yet to come. Also, before you close out, two things. If you have a topic that you would like us to discuss in the future, please let us know. Go ahead and type that in the chat or the Q&A section on the right of your screen. We'll take a look at that and see if we can get that covered in the future. And then secondly, once again, as a reminder, don't leave without checking out our handout section. Go there for some valuable assets based on today's discussion. So we're going to close it out. We wish all of you continued success going into the new year. Again, thank you, panelists. Much success to you as well. And we hope to engage with all of you again in 2023. Take care, and thank you so much.